Welcome to the WoW podcast, where we bring you inspiring stories and insights from our university community. Tune in for conversations about growth, success, and the power of communication in the academic world. So get ready to soar with us on the wings of wisdom.
All right, hello and welcome to the Wings of Wisdom WoW podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Mohsin Benson, and thank you for joining us today for another insightful conversation. Before we dive in, I'd like to introduce my co-host for this episode, WCC coach Heath Johnston. Heath, how's it going today?
I'm great. How are you?
Doing well. Thank you. You excited for our guest?
I am. I'm very excited for our guest because our guest is an esteemed associate professor of political science at Ashland University. He also serves as the director of the core curriculum and the director of citizen programs. His research centers around classical and medieval political philosophy, with notable contributions such as Xenophon's The Shorter Writings and Plato's Euthydemus. Before joining Ashland University in 2017, he held positions at Morehead State University, Emory University, and Gettysburg College. He's also a co-host of The New Thinkery, a successful podcast that explores political philosophy and its relevance across various media. Welcome, Dr. Greg McBrayer, to the Wings of Wisdom podcast.
Nice to meet you, Mr. Heath Johnston. And thank you for that excellent introduction. Very warm.
Of course.
Great to have you, Dr. McBrayer. It's been a long time trying to get you on the show, right?
Of course, yes. Yeah, it's nice to see you too, Mohsin. Please call me Greg, except for Heath. You still call me Professor Dr. McBrayer, please.
Of course.
All right, let's start with your experience as an undergraduate student at Emory University.
Sure.
How did that shape your academic and maybe even your career aspirations?
Sure. That's a fun topic, I suppose. I have to confess, I didn't much care for college, which is probably not very common for college professors. Most professors I know look back rather fondly on college, and I think that shapes in great part why they've chosen to pursue a career at it. They had such a good experience, they'd like to do it again. I actually started my college career at Emory University. I transferred away to Case Western Reserve University, just up the road here in Cleveland, Ohio. And then I transferred back to Emory. So sort of wandering vagabond. Yeah, I transferred away because I didn't really like Emory, didn't feel like I fit in. Went to Case, had a really good time, fit in better, but there wasn't really a course of study for me there. And that coupled with greater financial aid at Emory, I returned to Emory University. So my experience at Emory honestly was, I'm not trying to turn this into a sad episode, but I didn't feel like I fit in. Classes were strange. I didn't really understand what was going on. I didn't understand the purpose of college or the purpose of university. No one that I encountered seemed to be able to articulate a vision of what education should be at that stage. I'd been a very good high school student, very good test scores. I've always been kind of goal oriented. And so the goal, I did well in high school with the goal of getting into college. I chose my college on the basis of the following criteria. The highest ranked school I got into, according to U.S. News and World Report, is probably not the best way to choose what college you go to. So Emory University is rather prestigious, but I always felt a little bit like a fish out of water. I was sort of an average college student, mostly due to my lack of interest. My classes weren't very interesting, and so I thought B's were fine for the most part. So I made a few A's, a few C's, mostly B's. And then my junior year of college, I took a class with a guy named Robert Bartlett. It was called Ancient Political Thought, or Classical Political Thought, actually. I took it because I was a political science major, and also it was also satisfied the general education requirement. So I thought 2 birds, 1 stone. And I literally remember telling myself this would be the most boring class you ever take in college. And in fact, a weekend, I realized this was the only interesting college class I've ever had. We were reading Plato's Protagoras, not exactly a book that most people would say changed their lives, but it changed mine because it was my first serious encounter with a guy named Socrates. It was my first real time in college where I encountered an argument that I thought was wrong, but that I was incapable of refuting. And I really got this bug in my head that I would try to figure out what was wrong. I can talk more. I was mostly, my best classes in high school were math and science, but I didn't really see career paths in math. My dad was in the military. They didn't go to college. Neither of my parents went to college. I didn't really know what career options were available to people in the sciences other than medicine. So I got a job at the hospital my first year of college and discovered very quickly I don't like sick people. And so
What were you doing?
I worked in dermatology research. This is true.
Wow.
Yeah. I hated it. And so I just, I sort of wandered around there for a couple of years in college. Here and there I'd find an interesting class, but nothing really stood out to me. And then it was this class with Bartlett where I realized this is really interesting, but I didn't know what one could do if one was interested in Greek philosophy. Like you can't go work at like Home Depot and be the Greek philosophy guy or, Coca-Cola. I'm from Atlanta, by the way, if that's not obvious. And so it wasn't until my senior year that I started sort of asking myself, what could one do with, if I'm really interested in Greek philosophy, what can I do? And it was then that I realized that I would need to pursue graduate studies, which is something I didn't even know about really as an undergraduate. But my GPA wasn't very good, and so I went to a sort of middling master's degree program and never made anything less than an A after that because now I knew what I was up about. Now I knew what I was interested in, and so on and so forth. So that's I'm happy to answer other questions if you like, but that's kind of my undergraduate career in a nutshell, I suppose. Mediocre students. But it was, I think that's good enough.
Aren't you a wrestling champion, Greg? That case?
Champion is a bit of a stretch. I was actually the conference champion in college. And at one point I was, oh gosh, I don't like to brag. At one point I was in fact nationally ranked. They do a ranking of the top 8 and then they do like 4 also ranked, but they're not ranked numbered. And I was in that next group of 4, so top 12.
It's impressive.
But then I wrestled in the regional qualifier with a sprained ankle. I was the number 1 seed. Maybe I would have won if I had been healthy. I don't know. But yeah, I wrestled in college for 1 year at Case. I was 23-3 is my record. So I only lost 3 matches. One was the match I sprained my ankle. One was this regional qualifier match. And the only other match I lost was to a Division I kid who won the MAC. And so that made me feel pretty good. I actually beat, this sounds like I'm bragging. I guess I am. I beat our national runner-up at one point, in fact, in double overtime. That was pretty cool.
It's amazing.
But it's Division III, right? I mean, this is, no scholarships. I was an okay wrestler.
Knowing you throughout all of university, at least during my undergrad program, you've always talked about how having an active lifestyle is pretty important to student life and making sure to have that work-life balance. And I know that as both an administrator, a professor, and now a new father, you have differences in your work-life balance. So I guess maybe touch upon that. Are you more routine-oriented or are you more like free space-oriented, free time-oriented? How would you say that your day goes day to day?
Yeah, that's a good question. I've always been a routine person. Maybe I should not. I've always found that I've been most successful in life when I have had a routine. When I've had excessive demands on my time, I've found that having and keeping a schedule is very helpful. Then it's the only way I've been able to keep track of things and get them done. At this stage in life, I will say that, as you mentioned, I'm a new father, and it would be impossible for me to keep as many things in the air as I do without my wife, Hannah. So she really manages the house. She is carrying the bulk of the load on our son, Theodore. I mean, I do try to get him up most mornings, and I do try to put him to bed most nights. But I mean, during the day, she's really the primary caregiver. And so she's carrying a big part of that burden. But yeah, otherwise, I'm a routine guy. There are 2 things that I try to take care of every day outside of work proper. One, I guess, does fall under work technically, but I try to write or do research every day for about half an hour. That's my goal. If my calendar looks good, I try to get an hour in, and I try to exercise every day. And what's sort of psychologically helped me keep a work-life balance, as you say, Heath, is I attend some meetings that are not very productive. I won't say who or what those meetings are for, but if I've exercised and I've read and written, I'm much more tolerant of other time commitments that may not be as productive. So like if I'd taken care of my business myself, then I can sort of tolerate some of this other stuff. I think if I didn't do that, I would find myself much more frustrated when time gets wasted. And I'll also say that typically what I try to do is I try to do those things in the morning before I even go to work. So I try to exercise before 7 or 8, and I try to write before 9 or 10. That way, once I get to work, okay, now I can just work. It's work time. But yeah, work-life balance is very important. I guess the audience for this is typically undergraduates. I mean, there's a lot. Look, exercise is very important. I think that it helps it helps get my stress level down because I'm physically exerting myself. My job is very sedentary. You know this, Heath. All I do is sit around. I don't really do anything at work. And so, I've got to get some calories out. I got to get some frustration out. That's a big important part. For young people also, when you're 18 to 22, you can kind of do anything. And when I was your age, I could do anything and get away with it. But the older you get, you really have to take care of, am I drinking enough water? Am I getting enough sleep? Am I getting outside? Am I talking to friends? This is going to sound lame. Have I hugged anybody today? I'm serious. Dr. Ben Said will confirm. I hugged him today. I saw him today.
Yes, you did.
The part of a very important part of a life is friends. And so another thing I try to do is spend time with my friends. And young people your age, Heath, probably don't realize how difficult it is for people once you get out of college to make friends. And so you have to be very intentional about, just like you have to be intentional about exercise, you have to be intentional about making friends. There's all kind of research right now. I just saw something the other day. I don't remember the exact data, so I'll just make up the numbers, but a majority of young people can't name a friend of their fathers or mothers. That's sad to me. And it doesn't just happen. In college, it's so easy. You're around so many people. But once one gets out into the workforce, it's very difficult to make friends, especially lasting, meaningful friendships. And so fortunately, as Dr. Ben Said knows, he and I work out with the same group of hooligans. You've come a couple times, I think, Heath.
I have,
and so that's in the morning I meet and I exercise, but I exercise with friends. And so it's sort of killing two birds with one stone. And we're outside. And so I you've got to get fresh air. You've got to get exercise. You've got to be in touch with your friends. So most mornings I start the morning off with some of my closest friends. And we're exercising. And then, I don't know about you, Mohsin, but that sort of jumpstarts me into the day. Is that a good answer for the student? You feel free to, you guys should interrupt me if you have questions or you don't like my answer, or you disagree, or maybe you think not having a routine is very important. Actually, I like to live an anarchic life. And how dare you be so oppressive?
Very Greek of you.
Yeah, very Greek of me. That's right. I don't exercise in the Greek fashion, if that's what you're suggesting.
I hope so. I hope not. I hope not.
Yeah. Students will have to Google that. I didn't mean to exercise in the Greek fashion.
Let me ask about what brought you to Ashland. Well, I suppose the job did, right? But what made you choose Ashland?
Yeah. The weather. No. Well, it's the world headquarters of nice people, which I jokingly talk about on my own podcast. So I don't know if this brought me here, but it's kept me here. That I say that a little tongue in cheek, talking about the world headquarters of nice people, but it really is true. It's really a welcoming community. As Heath was listing all the universities I've worked at, I've moved around a lot. My father was in the military. I think I already mentioned that. And so I've moved around a lot my entire life. And I realized that I had never lived in a domicile for more than 3 years in my entire life until I moved to Ashland, Ohio. So one of the things that keeps me here is I feel like I've really put down roots in the community. I feel like I've tried to ingratiate myself to my colleagues here at the university. I think I have a fairly good reputation. I've tried to work hard with colleagues. I've tried to work hard on their behalf. I've tried to be a good mentor to students, the ones with potential anyway. Heath, the ones with potential. And so that's what keeps me here. What brought me here? To be quite honest, I was at a school in Kentucky where things were kind of going sour, and so I had put some feelers out. And then things improved, and I ended up being happy at Kentucky, this school, not University of Kentucky, another school. But because I had put feelers out in the past, some folks here at Ashland reached out to me and asked me if I would apply for a job. I wasn't really interested in the first job they sent my way, and then they said, well, what if it were this job instead? And I said, oh, well, maybe. And these folks were both university faculty members, but also affiliated with the Ashbrook Center. And so the big appeal for me to come to Ashland University was the opportunity to work at the Ashbrook Center, because students like Heath, who's here on the podcast, I have access to students who are called Ashbrook Scholars, and which means, I really enjoy getting to teach students who are in an honors program specifically for history and political science majors. So in my area of study, I have students, I'll give you an example. So every other place I've ever taught, the challenge has always been to try to get students to take seriously the idea that a thinker who's been dead and gone for hundreds of years might have something to teach us. My very first lecture here, or class here, seminar, I was sort of, well, Aristotle says the following. And then the students were like, well, then, yeah, okay, then that's right. And I was like, I was not prepared for having to get students to take seriously the possibility that maybe Aristotle's wrong about some things. So that was unique. But so the opportunity to work in the Ashbrook Scholar Center with these Ashbrook scholars like Heath, with whom I've traveled to Italy, for example, I've had in class several times, so I can form relationships with students. There are resources to make things available to students that are not available at other schools. That's what attracted me to the place. My big reservation about moving here, honestly, I was joking, but the weather, and my family's in Georgia. So it was a little bit of a hard decision to leave Kentucky for Ohio, because it adds, 4 to 5 hours to a trip to see my folks. But I love it here. It's great. It's a great place. I like the community. I also like that the university has a Christian heritage. I don't know exactly. I'm never very good at saying this precisely, but I am. Listeners might think I'm confused, because on the one hand, I sort of really think that it's valuable for people to have shared values and this, that, and the other. On the other hand, I think that I don't want anybody to tell me what to think. And so I was attracted to this. As I understood, Ashland, it presents itself as offering a third way, which is sort of saying we're religious and we encourage people of faith, but we're not requiring it. And so I would be somewhat reluctant to teach at a place that had a statement of faith requirement for faculty, for example. I would be reluctant to be at a place that mandated that students have to go to chapel. But I would be totally happy at a place where students choose to go to chapel. And so I like a place that's hospitable to the sorts of things that I find interesting without mandating it. And I find that attractive. Most of my experience has been at much more secular kinds of institutions. But I don't want to name names, but you can all think of colleges that I would not want to be at because they're too religious and because they're completely inhospitable to religion. I mentioned, for example, that I felt very out of place at Emory. One of the reasons was it was extremely hostile to anybody of faith or anybody with a conservative sort of political persuasion, and it was very unwelcoming to people like me. It was Emory University's in Georgia, and I was the only kid I knew from Georgia. Wow. There were some other kids who lived in Atlanta, but their families had moved there, whereas actually, anyway, so that's a long answer to a short question. I talk too much.
I love that you are very open about how you're describing the freedoms that you have here at Ashland University, as opposed to more of like a tight, kind of more structured on what the professors can and can't teach, or
yeah, I don't like that at all. Yeah.
I guess, how does that play into your teaching of Greek political philosophy, and like your expansiveness on how you can be more open of what can be taught out of these books rather than what is specifically written? I know you talk a lot on The New Thinker about more reading into the text and figuring out exactly what these people are saying. So I guess
are you just trying to get me to say pederasty, Heath? Is that what's
going on?
No. Okay, all right. Can you so can you tell me what you mean? Like, do you mean? Yeah, I'm having trouble understanding your question. Do you mean, do I feel comfortable teaching Greek philosophy here?
No, I mean the question, I think, is more of I guess I'm trying to get at. I was wondering how you feel about being so free on teaching your Greek courses, whereas some universities are very rigid on how professors teach certain courses and try to drive an agenda. But having heard from your course, it seems more open-ended, and what the student gets out of it is more to each individual.
That's okay, good. Well, I thank you for that. It sounded like there might have been some praise for my class implicit in that, Heath. So yeah, that's a good question. I do not feel first, I teach, I think, great books. And for the most part, I teach ancient Greek philosophy, political philosophy. So Aristotle, Plato, and my special darling, Xenophon. And one of the beautiful things about these texts is that I think that they raise what I would call fundamental questions, or questions that are coeval with man, which is, these are questions that human beings who want to become educated or want to become free should ask themselves. And these particular thinkers, Plato, Aristotle, Xenophon, probably more controversial, I suppose, in the case of Aristotle, but I think it's true of him as well, that they don't simply tell you the way things are. They try to get you to see that there are questions that intelligent human beings have to answer. So, for example, I'm teaching Plato's Republic. I teach that book somewhat regularly, and it's an investigation into justice. And so I don't think that text offers an easy answer. I'm not sure it offers an answer at all, actually, although at least officially it does. And so therefore, I don't feel like it's demanding that students believe anything, which is not to say that I think Plato, Aristotle, and Xenophon are not teaching us any. But I think that they're trying to get students to rethink their opinions. How better to say this? Maybe I'll go back to my own experience for a moment that I alluded to at the beginning of reading the Protagoras for the first time in college with Professor Bartlett. Bartlett never told me what he thought about anything, at least not until years later when we became friends. I never knew where he stood on things, and I thought that was great. And I try to model that in my class as well. It's a little harder working at the Ashbrook Center because people know that has a certain tendency, and that if you work there, you probably are at least sympathetic to it, which is true in my case. But what happened is, I'll just tell you, Socrates, in this dialogue, Socrates is speaking to a man named Protagoras, who is a sophist, which means that he was a professional teacher. And at one point, Socrates says to Protagoras that no one voluntarily does wrong. And I just thought, well, that's just bonkers. That's clearly wrong. Like last Friday night, I went out with the specific purpose of doing wrong, and I succeeded, and I don't remember what happened. I'm kidding. This is a hypothetical story. I was a good kid. But that rattled me. And so I hope what's happening in my classes in the best cases is that they're encountering ideas and arguments that challenge what they think. And I don't think I'm an iconoclast. I don't think I'm in there trying to wreck irresponsibly students' opinions, but I am trying to get them to rethink them. And maybe it's the case that some of those opinions don't withstand rational scrutiny. But in other words, I'm trying to model what I think Socrates himself was doing. I'm not comparing myself to him except to say that I'm trying to imitate him. I think his model of teaching is the best, which is he's willing to challenge people, and he's willing to let them not be challenged. And so if a student wants to say, who cares, whatever, then I'm sort of content to let them. But for those few students who sort of get irritated like I did and think, no, there's something more here, I want to figure it out. Those are the students that I'm most interested in. And I try to reach them by pointing them to things that have helped me. So I try to put books before students that have been most helpful to me and seeing most clearly questions about love, justice, friendship, death, God, those sorts of things. And I think you'd be hard pressed to find a student who said I was trying to give them a specific answer to any of those questions. I hope that's helpful.
Definitely, yeah. Thank you so much.
Greg, how does the atmosphere at AU or the Ashland University experience help support that type of teaching?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, I think that being a place that is affirming of people of faith and affirming of people not of faith, that's helpful. I think the accent on the individual, one of our famous taglines, I think that's conducive to this kind of education. But also this other tagline that you often hear, the administration, professors, students, teaching you how to think, not what to think. And so for me, that's what I do, I think is perfectly compatible with what Ashland sees itself as doing. and what I hope is happening in core classes across the institution. I do have some of the founding documents. The core as it currently is instantiated, that took place before I was the core director. But one of the reasons I was interested in the job was because they sent me some of the founding materials about the core. And in fact, Socratic is in the official founding documents for the core, that courses should be taught in a Socratic fashion, that they should be conversations, and that they should be focused on great books and questions. And all of that, I think that may be why I got the job, because I mean, that's right up my alley. Like, I don't think we should be telling students what to think. I don't think we should be, despite how much I'm talking on this podcast, I try not to lecture. I mean, a typical class with me is we have a book open, we read a passage, and we try to figure out what the heck's going on. And that's kind of it. And I think that I'm not alone. Many of my colleagues teach in a similar fashion. And I hope that it's happening all over the college, all over the university. Yeah, I mean, I feel welcomed here. I feel supported by the administration generally. I definitely feel supported by Ashbrook. My colleagues, I mean, I've been a part of a faculty reading group with members of my department, with members of other departments. I've had reading groups with Russell Weaver individually, who's a professor of English. Maybe you've had him on the podcast. I've also had ones that he leads for faculty. This seems like a place that is intellectually curious without being dogmatic, which I like.
And you were talking a lot about how the core curriculum supports your teaching style, and you are the director of the core curriculum and
I am
director of citizen programs. So whether currently or in the past, are there any developments that you are excited or have been excited about in the past that you would love to share or talk about?
Sure. So you mentioned that I'm director of citizen programs. That's for Ashbrook, not for Ashland University. So I'll talk about that, and then I can talk about Ashland as well. So for Ashbrook, I have been the director of citizen programs. I'm actually not sure what my title is right now, but I helped start Ashbrook's podcast called The American Idea, which I think has been great. They get, 1,000 or more listens per episode. I think they're well over 250,000, maybe approaching 500,000 total all-time downloads. There was some resistance to that at the beginning. People thought, I don't think this is a good idea. I don't think Ashbrook should get into this from the conversation business. I said, you can have conversations on podcasts. And it turns out it's become extremely, I think, successful. Jeff Sickinga, the executive director, hosts that. By the way, he was always supportive of the podcast. And I think that's done really well. As director of citizen programs, I've also helped some people. I helped with this. So other people took the lead on this. But we've begun continuing legal education for lawyers. So that's another major initiative in citizen programs. And there are other few things that I've done with Ashbrook, thinking about how to reach citizens. In my role with the university as core director, I'm pretty happy to say that we had something passed where we've passed what's called a core within a core. This hasn't been implemented yet because I've been working on it. So, excuse me. So this core within the core means what I got passed legislatively through Faculty Senate is this notion that students can take a voluntary set of courses within the core around a particular theme. So the one that I've already passed is called a Great Books Core. Now I've been delaying in executing it because I've been trying to make sure that we have enough courses throughout the core that would be a part of this sort of special inner core. So we've just started a minor also called Classical Learning, which I played a role in, which I'm very excited about. My colleague Joe Griffith is going to be the director of this classical learning minor. And to that end, I've actually, I helped in conjunction with the math department get a class on the books called Euclid. And so there is now a core class on Euclid, which is awesome.
Wow.
And that will probably be the math class that students in that minor will take. I'll also say that, thanks to the help of Chris Swanson and Gordon Swain, faculty members in the Department of Math, they collaborated, they did most of the work. And also, by the way, for the last 6 months, we've been doing a reading group on Euclid. Those two faculty members, myself, Joe Griffith, and Sabrina Maristella, who works in the Ashbrook Center. So that's really exciting, trying to put something in place that's a little more classically focused. If we can pair that with the core, that would be really good. There's a bunch of other little stuff along the way that I've been kind of proud of, but sometimes it's a small role. Sometimes it's reaching out to a board member. Sometimes it's persuading a dean or a provost or a chair of some committee to make some small change. And sometimes it's best if not, that's not all well known how all that stuff goes down. But, you know, just trying to help make this a better school for folks all around as I can.
That's amazing, Greg. Heath mentioned the podcast, the new Thinkery podcast, and
Right.
probably people don't know this, or not a lot of people know this. You're one of the founders and co-hosts of the podcast, a very successful podcast. How did this project come about, and what do you enjoy most about exploring political philosophy with your friends, right?
Yeah.
Co-hosts through this podcasting medium.
How did it come about? So when I got the job at Ashland from Morehead State in Kentucky, where I was at the time, I thought when I moved to Ashland, I'd like to start a podcast. David Barr, who's one of my co-hosts, he's a friend of mine. He attended undergraduate at the University of Maryland, where I was a graduate student. Funny story is he and I were in a class in political philosophy, and it was just sort of an okay class. But he was a pretty impressive young man. And I said, look, if you're really interested in this, you need to go study with this other guy here, Butterworth, who was my professor. And he ended up taking this class with Butterworth, and he was like, oh, you're right, this guy's really impressive. This is the real deal. And then we hit it off. We've become lifelong friends. So he was working for the Weekly Standard, which was a conservative magazine for years and years that was shut down as a result of, it was shut down in 2016 for political reasons. But at the time, the main editor of the Weekly Standard was a guy named Bill Kristol. This is a very famous person. He used to regularly be on Fox News. He used to be a very prominent, leading neoconservative intellectual. He's now does not consider himself to be conservative and works on something called the Bulwark, among other things. But he very generously sat down with David and me to talk about podcasting, because he has a very successful podcast called Conversations with Bill Kristol. And I talked to him about my ideas and my interests and this, that, and the other. And I said, look, I'm starting this job at Ashbrook. I think it might be a good idea to start a podcast. And David and I spoke with him for a good while. And Bill looked at me and said, look, you should do what you want to do and not do this other thing. You should do something on political philosophy. I was like, oh, okay. And I tucked that away in my head, and I thought maybe he's right. So that's part one. Part two is Alex Priu, my co-host, and I, we would regularly attend conferences in philosophy and in political philosophy and in politics. And we noticed that, so Alex and I are sort of in the middle of the age range of people who are interested in these things. There's young grad students, and then there's older, very established faculty. And we were kind of in this middle zone. And what we noticed is that the old people really liked us, and the young people really liked us. The young people liked us because we could serve as a conduit to introducing them to the old people. And the old people liked us because we were kind of young and fun and energetic. The other thing we really noticed, so as we were trying to figure out what kind of a podcast we were going to do, was that the young people especially, and the old people to some degree, what they seemed really to like is that at conferences, Alex and I would sort of hang out in the bar. Alex would be drinking heavily, and I, of course, would be having water because I'm a modest, moderate man and very behaved. But what we noticed is that people seemed really to enjoy the way that Alex and I could mix talking about the most profound subtleties of philosophy with fart jokes. It was just a combination that people don't encounter that much in regular life. Usually people who are interested in philosophy are stuffy and not very serious, or excuse me, not very funny. And people who are very funny are not very serious. And it seemed to us that what people really liked was this combination of the high and the low. So, and then we decided, Alex and David and I were trying to figure out what to call ourselves. And there's this guy named Aristophanes who wrote an ancient play about Socrates. It's a comedy. And in that play, Socrates lives in a place called the Thinkery, or the think tank, or something like this. And so we were like, we should name it something related to Aristophanes. This was my point. And then Alex said, oh, you're absolutely right. We should call it the New Thinkery. So that's how it came about. It's been enormously successful, as you mentioned. My friend Alex, he just landed a job at a new university called the University of Austin in Texas. It's the first new university in like 80 years or something like that in the United States. And I'm confident that our podcast played no small role in his successfully attaining that job. It sounds weird, but in this little bitty niche small market of political philosophy, Alex and David and I have become minor celebrities. It's sort of crazy to, like, it's funny. I mean, like, I realize that being a minor celebrity in the niche field means you're not famous at all, but we go to conferences and people know who we are.
Right.
And people come up and talk. I mean, last conference I was at, a kid was running at me, and I sort of, I thought, what injustice have I done? I was quickly trying to rack my brain to figure out, and he just ran over. Was like, "Oh my God, I love the new Thancred." I was like, "Oh, thanks." And that's kind of neat. Yeah, so it's been a great source of fun. There's no doubt in my mind that it's opened up doors for me, for David, for Alex. And the biggest thing is, as you mentioned, they're my friends. And so what it means is, on a relatively regular basis, almost weekly, we release episodes weekly. We don't record every week. Very regularly, I get to talk to two of my close friends, and we get to talk about things we love, and we get to cut up and make jokes. And it turns out people kind of like it. So even better. We now have a store, so you can buy like a hat or something like this, or T-shirt. Yeah. They're not very. I designed them, so I think they need some work. But yeah, so that's been fun.
I wonder if you could hire
Sorry?
Burkett.
I should hire Burkett. Yeah, that's actually a really good idea.
He's wonderful. Yeah, he's great.
Yeah, that's a very good idea.
If you could pick an episode for the listeners to this podcast to listen to, I mean, obviously, if it's wouldn't recommend it, but
right.
What would be your favorite episode that you think you've either recorded or released?
Yeah. When do you think this episode? When do you think this episode will be released?
In 3 weeks.
In a few weeks. Too many to mention. We've had some. So sorry, I should mention also that. So we have two missions on the podcast. One of which is just to do political philosophy and have a good time. The second actually is it is our mission, in fact, to interview senior faculty who we think are special and whose voices could be preserved in some way. So one of the most special episodes for me was with a gentleman named David Lowenthal, who was one of the first political philosophy professors at Boston College, which became a major hub of political philosophy. He was 90 some odd years old, and we'd heard that he was kind of not in very good health. We recorded an episode with him where he sounded great. He sounded lucid, hilarious, witty, charming, insightful, and he died within a couple of weeks after recording. His daughter reached out to us and said that she thought that he summoned up his strength for this one last final thing, which was our interview. And we've subsequently heard from his grandchildren how moved they were that they now have this audio of their grandfather for the rest of their lives. So that's a special episode. We discussed a work by him on Orwell, but I'll give a second one. Just so that one's fun, and it was just very deep and meaningful to me. Like, hey, we did something like this guy's grandchildren now have this for the rest of their lives. I'll go a slightly different route. One of my favorite episodes we did was a couple years ago on Dickens' A Christmas Carol. A Christmas Carol is, when I was a kid, it was one of my favorite stories. When I was a teenager, one of my favorite movies is A Muppets Christmas Carol. I still love that movie. I watch it every Christmas. And a few years ago, I started reading A Christmas Carol every Christmas. And I realized that this book is deeply interesting, and that I think it suffers from it's so famous that people don't actually take the time to evaluate the story. So that episode is fantastic. I'll just give a little preview. I think that A Christmas Carol is a reflection on mortality. In other words, you may or may not remember that the opening words of the book are, Marley was dead. And so Scrooge is, I think, just like Cephalus in the Republic, Heath, Scrooge is an old man who's never reflected on his mortality. And this theme of mortality comes up again and again, and I think sets the stage for the ghosts visiting him. You may remember that it's the anniversary of Marley's death. Then we learn that his sister has died. His nephew comes to visit him. So there's all this death percolating in his brain before he has the visits from the ghosts. So I suspect that a big part of this, in other words, I think it's a very good story that people don't ever think about, because it's sort of it's just on in the background and you're watching it and it's sort of funny, but it's a reflection on miserliness and mortality, and the way in which Scrooge is trying to conquer his death by hoarding up money, if that makes sense.
That's incredible.
It's curious that he has all this money and he lives in basically abject poverty. He lives in this he lives in this old decrepit building. He doesn't spend his money on anything. So he's trying to hoard it up. Anyway, that's a fun episode.
Who's the guest in the episode again?
There's no guest for that one. That was me and Alex and David.
Gotcha.
So yeah, we have guests probably on a third to half the episodes, something like that. Our funniest episodes are when it's just the three of us. We tend to be more respectful when we have guests.
I've noticed
unless
that.
we know the guest also has a sense of humor. Yeah. We've actually had some fairly influential thinkers turn us down because they think we're too juvenile. But I've reassured them that we can tone it down when need be. One of the funniest things is we know that grad students listen to us in political philosophy programs around the country because we can target. You get, just like you guys probably get data. You can see where people listen, so we know where people are listening. So it's not surprising that graduate students, kids 22 to 25, who've just become interested in these things, that's not surprising. What's been surprising is when I'd run into a very senior person who's completely respectable, and they accidentally let slip that they listen to the new Think Tree. And then I'm like, oh my God, you listen. And then a little bit of shame comes over me because I realize, oh my God, they heard me make that terrible fart joke. This is a person who I deeply respect and admire. Anyway.
Who doesn't like fart jokes, Greg, right?
That's what I'm saying. They're funny. Farts are funny. I don't care who you are.
And they're littered all throughout Greek literature and Shakespeare and everything.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
You want to ask the next one, Heath?
Yeah, for sure. I guess, what would you say would be if you could give one piece of advice aside from, exercising, keeping a routine, depending on who you are, unless you're an anarchist. What would be one piece of advice to help a student either improve their lifestyle in college? And I know that you studied a variety of different topics when you're an undergrad, and then you found your calling, or at least what someone would call their calling, as a junior, because this is a time to make decisions. What would be I guess one piece of advice that you would give an undergrad student?
Just one? Goodness gracious.
Or more. Go ahead.
Sure. The number one would be, as you mentioned, as you reminded me, that I didn't find it till I was a junior, what I was sort of passionate about. And I think that too often young people come to college thinking they know what life is about and knowing what they want to be, knowing what career path they want to choose. If I could give you one piece of advice, and only one, it would be remain open or alive to the possibility that you may not yet know yourself, and therefore know a lot about yourself, including, among other things, what you might want to do for a living. Remain alive or open to the possibility that you may not have figured things out yet. The reason I teach the books that I teach, that I've tried to discuss, is because I suspect that, at 18, I thought I knew what justice was. At 18, I thought I knew what love was. At 18, I thought I knew what friendship, God. You can go on down the list. My subsequent education has taught me how little I knew about some of these things. And so I think if I could only give one piece of advice, it would be that. Try to remain alive to the possibility that you may not have things figured out. I could give practical advice. I think students should study abroad. I already mentioned, Heath, you and I went to Italy together. I did not study abroad as an undergraduate. I wish that I had. I think that students should consider studying a foreign language. I think that's essential. Only in America can an educated person speak a single language. We're the only country in the world that considers you educated if you can only speak one language. Study abroad, learn a foreign language. I have some other advice that I heard a college president give once that I sort of support. I'll say it to students. They'll think I'm crazy. Take math until you get a C. Take science classes until you get a C. So I think students can be too worried about their grades and they don't want to take things, but you should study things. Math is a skill that will be helpful to you no matter what you do. So why not keep taking some classes? That's the kind of stuff I would give advice. But the number one would be remain open to the possibility that you don't understand everything, which would mean, by the way, practically speaking, you should probably seek out classes that address these questions in meaningful ways. Good professors reading good books.
Very good.
I'll push you a little bit on that.
Yeah, please.
I
didn't know it was going to be that kind of an interview. Heath, I should have known.
We were
crooked media. Yep. Yep.
How important do you think it is to a student to fail? And if they fail, should they continue failing until they succeed?
So as I mentioned, I mean, Mohsin he's such a good human being. He tries to praise how good of a wrestler I was. I was an okay wrestler. I was on a state champion wrestling team my senior year of high school. And there was one kid on the team who consistently just beat the tar out of me. He was so talented, so quick, so athletic. He also went on to wrestle in college. But he did not succeed and quickly left. And I suspect that it was because it was the first time in his life he wasn't simply better than everybody. I will say, I think failure is essential for young people. Because you got to know what you're made of. And you've got to know that you can pick yourself back up. You also have to know that it's not the end of the world. Who cares? You know, my dad gave me advice when I was a young person that the older I've gotten, I've tried to return to more and more. And I think Mohsin probably sees this in how we exercise together and other aspects of my life. But like, what helps me keep my work-life balance? What helps me keep peace with myself? What helps me keep peace with myself is that I try to do my best all the time. And then I'm okay with failure now. When I was a young man, I remember trying my best at something and failing, and I beat myself up for years about it. And at the end of the day, you can't control. All you can control is how hard you try and if you're giving your best at something. You can't control the results. And so that failure is an important lesson along the way for that. The most successful people I know all fail. I mean, Steve Jobs. I mean, you can go down the list with successful businessmen, successful politicians, successful philosophy people. They're all people who've figured out how to adapt and change in response to failure. And so that's kind of the idea why I was saying, try this. I also think that why the exercise is so important. I do think that exercise is important in and of itself, but I also think it's important because there's a way in which this sort of psychological toughness that's involved in physical exercise can carry over to other parts of your life. That's at least one of the reasons that I do it, actually. You can persist with things. So a small example is, I did an intensive summer institute on Greek. It was, to this day, I'll say it's probably the most demanding thing I've ever done in my life. But it was purely intellectual. I mean, it wasn't physically, I guess it was physically demanding as far as I was very tired all the time. I had to stay up very late studying. But like just that kind of toughness that I had gotten from wrestling kind of carried over into the study of language. I was like, you can do this. Like, just stick it out, tough it out. So yeah. All right. That was, again, a long-winded answer, but failure is very important. No, it's not the end of the world.
It's a very inspirational answer.
I would say those are words of wisdom.
Yeah, absolutely.
Or is it Wings of Wisdom? Which one is it?
Podcast is about. Yeah, Wings of Wisdom.
Wings. It was. Those were some. That was wisdom coming in hot on some wings.
Yeah, flying
in.
Blazing glory.
Wings. Right.
Oh well, yes. Since you mentioned the podcast, so another objective of the podcast is to address the significance of effective communication for college students.
So I was a case study on how not to communicate. This last hour, don't be like McBrayer. Good.
Keep your mouth shut.
Yeah, keep your mouth. Very good. What role does it play in students' academic and personal success? And I know, like you really stress that in your classes. You'd like students to be active in class, participate, take part in all the discussions. Why is that important?
Well, you guys. Communication is not just written. You guys know this, of course, right? That's why we're talking about oral communication skills, oral communication skills, writing. How can one represent oneself with art, for example? The best way I can think of it is they're all the reasons that we all know for why one should learn how to communicate well. You'll be more successful in life. People will take you more seriously if you can be persuasive, all kinds of stuff like that. But for me, the major reason, the single greatest reason, which is not to say the only reason, but the single greatest reason to learn how to communicate clearly and well is because clear communication is a sign of clear thinking. And so if you cannot write well if you're incapable of thinking well, you can't give a good speech or a good talk if you can't think well. And so as I think about why it's important for me because I'm trying to understand things. And to the degree that I'm better at writing and better at speaking, I take those as outward signs of the fact that I've become better at thinking. And that's why I think that's the primary goal of a university, is become better at thinking. And writing and speaking are outward symbols of that, or outward manifestations of clear thinking. Is that kind of at all what you had in mind?
That's a very deep answer. Thank you.
Oh, yeah. But I mean, of course, so you're probably going to, you do this podcast with all kinds of people. So you all know that you go to a job, you're going to do better at a job interview. You're going to do better. There are all those reasons. But the real reason is now you can think better. And by the way, also, therefore, you can interpret better the communication of others and not be hoodwinked by them. So I teach a course on rhetoric, for example. Did you take that class, Heath?
About to, upcoming in the spring.
Yeah, I'm teaching it again this coming spring. So I should use this opportunity to plug the class.
There you go.
I'm teaching political rhetoric in the spring. This is one form of communication. So one studies rhetoric for a number of reasons, one of which is to learn how to speak well oneself, of course. But another is so that you don't fall victim to someone who's a slick speaker. Why does one study math? There's a lot of reasons to study math, right? But one reason is so that you're not the victim of people who are able to manipulate you financially. You can think about the simple example. If you can't count change properly, people are going to rob you. But if you don't understand statistics, somebody's going to be able to present trends to you that are false or something like this. So one reason to be able to understand these things is so that one can simply understand better and not be duped by stuff. Oh, I see what you did. You just used a rhetorical trick. That's not actually a valid argument. You can distinguish sophistical refutations from valid syllogism, that kind of thing. I can distinguish math and statistical inferences from somebody just putting numbers up on a board and trying to dupe me. I can understand when a politician is saying something meaningful versus just empty like all of these things are like, and by the way, of course, therefore, if you can think more clearly and think for yourself and think independently, as I've just said, independently, you're therefore more free. You're not dependent on someone else to be able to make change for you. You're not dependent upon someone else to tell you what this data means. You're not dependent upon for X, for Y, for Z, right? You guys know, I mean, most freshmen this semester are reading Frederick Douglass's narrative of the life, his early autobiography. And he connects very clearly literacy to freedom. All of these things I want to be free. I don't want anybody to tell me what to think. And so these are all ways in which one can become free. Heath was my teaching assistant for first year seminar last fall. But this semester he said, not again. No more McBrayer.
No.
Give me anyone but McBrayer.
I branched out.
He branched out. See, exactly. He had to spread his wings.
Dr. Weaver and
of wisdom.
Mr. McDonald's.
Yes. Right. There you go.
Right.
No, I think talking about Frederick Douglass, he talks about how education is like the freeing element as well, and it helps.
Look, if you want to keep people unfree, keep them uneducated, right? I mean, I grew up in West Berlin. As I mentioned, my dad was in the military, and one of the things that these communist regimes tried to do to maintain control over people was to control their education. And certain things were off limits. You couldn't read certain things, right? And why was that? Because they both, like, just like Frederick Douglass's slave owners, just like the communists, people recognize that the only way to if you're going to control people, you have to keep them stupid. And so learn how to communicate, learn how to think, learn how to read, learn how to write, so that you can think for yourself.
Beautiful. We don't want to take so much time from your busy schedule.
These are the wings of wisdom right here. Yeah.
If you allow us, can we ask one last question?
Of course. I am your humble servant.
If you could share any upcoming projects or goals, again, like you mentioned, the course you're going to be teaching this spring, or maybe even the goals you have for your podcast, your teaching, or the programs you're directing at AU, or even an upcoming trip that you'd like to promote on the platform. You mentioned.
Well, as you mentioned, I'm sorry.
You mentioned the Italy trip with Heath.
Yeah. I mean, I'm going to Brussels in a couple weeks to deliver a paper. I'm pretty excited about that, but that's not probably of great interest to students. I am teaching the rhetoric class in the spring. I don't even know what number it is. Do you know? It's like poli-sci 2 something. I'll have to find that out so I can tell people what class that is. They can take it. It's the first time it's being offered. Last time it was offered as a special course. So it's just now, this is the first time it's being offered as an official course. I'm actually going to be applying for sabbatical this fall because I'm working on a book on Xenophon, of which I have 4 chapters roughly written. I would like to spend next year finishing that book. It's a book on the education of Cyrus. This will be my first. He very nicely at the beginning mentioned the 2 books that I've done already. They're both translations, one of Plato, one of Xenophon. My goal is to have my first manuscript out where it's just my work. It's on the education of Cyrus, and big theme of the book is trying to understand how he tried to rule the entire known world by simultaneously reducing most people to the status below human beings. And more interesting, actually, to me, is how he tried to divinize himself, how he tried to make himself come to be worshipped by people. So that's a book that I hope to have finished in maybe a year, which means it'll be published maybe in 2 years. That's my biggest project I'm working on right now.
It's amazing.
It's huge, impressive.
Thanks. Well, we'll see if it comes out. See if anybody accepts it.
You better sign mine when I get the copy.
Of course. It's my favorite student.
Well, that wraps up today's episode of the WoW podcast. Thank you, Dr. McBrayer, for taking the time out of your incredibly busy schedule to join us
Of course.
on the podcast.
Thank you so much.
Your insights on political philosophy, your experiences at Ashland University, as an undergraduate student, as a faculty member, and also your insightful perspectives on work-life balance were really inspiring. So thanks for all of that.
Listeners should know that Mohsin Ben Said also has a very good work-life balance. So I admire him.
You're embarrassing me now.
Good. Thank you, Dr. Ben Said. Thank you, Mr. Johnston. It's been a pleasure. I'm sorry that it took so long to get this out. It's been fun. Your questions were good, and they made me think, and I talked too much, so I'll have to chastise myself for that later. But thanks. It's been great fun.
Thank you so much.
Being on the WoW podcast.
There you go. So listeners and viewers, thank you so much for joining us. If you enjoyed this conversation, be sure to check out other episodes on both Spotify and YouTube. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share to stay updated, on our latest episodes. And, keep exploring and stay curious. Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to the WoW podcast, where curiosity meets inspiration. Brought to you by the Writing and Communication Center at Ashland University.